Hello, true duelists, and welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! Single Card History, where I talk about some of the cards that have impacted Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout the years, and some of the other ones that didn't. Today's card, the board breaker that's only gotten better with time, Super Polymerization. Super Polymerization was first released in Phantom Darkness in 2008 as a rare, which is somewhat surprising to think about in our current era of good card equals high rarity, or at least in so many cases. But it wouldn't take long for this card to get blinged out. It would get a secret rare printing and legendary collection to the Duel Academy Years Mega Pack in 2011, which, good God, what a name. It got a Peasant rare printing in the Cyber Dragon Revolution Structure deck in 2014, and a super rare printing in OTS Pack 9 in 2018. Its next OTS Pack printing would bring it an Ultimate Rare in OTS Pack 14 in 2020. It got a Premium Gold Rare print in 2020 as well in Maximum Gold. It would get a Starlight Rare printing in Battles of Legend Crystal's Revenge in 2022, and it would get a Quarter Century Secret Rare in the following Battles of Legend set in 2023 in Monstrous Revenge. For time on the ban list, this card was at 3 up until the October 2014 ban list, where it would end up being limited. It would then be banned shortly after that on the January 2015 ban list, where it would stay for just shy of 4 years, before coming back to 1 again on the September 2018 ban list. The April 2019 ban list would see it come to semi-limited status once again, and as of July 2019, as of May making this video, it's been at 3 ever since. A quick play spell card, its effect reads: discard 1 card, fusion summon 1 fusion monster from your extra deck, using monsters from either field as fusion material. Neither player can activate cards or effects in response to this card's activation. Super Poly is what the kids call Speed Spell 4. That's not a real term in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's just the community's way of describing an effect that cannot be responded to, and it's a damn strong quality to have, especially on a card that can remove monsters from the opponent's field. Dark Ruler No More and Forbidden Droplet are both pseudo Speed Spell 4 cards as well, with Dark Ruler No More only being able to be responded to with either spell or trap cards, and Droplet only being able to be responded to with certain card types depending on what it is the player sent to the grave in order to activate Droplet's, effect. Super Poly here, meanwhile, is just Speed Spell 4 outright to any and all card effects for no real cost or reason. There's a discard for cost, I know, but I think you get my point, which is a very long-winded way of me saying that this is a damn strong card. On release, it didn't really see an abundance of play due to the niche aspect of it, that being that it's a fusion spell, and its strongest effect, being able to use the opponent's monsters, is only as good as the monsters that you're able to summon, which I mean in 2 ways. The monsters being summoned, being decent, makes Super Poly at least decent, but much more importantly than that is the monsters being summonable, because Fusion as a card type tends to need specific monsters in order to, make your fusion monster, the polymerization of 2 cards. And if your opponent isn't playing a card that you can poly with, you're not really going to be playing this card. For this reason, it wasn't seen in an abundance of decks, but one notable name would be Elemental Hero. Between 2009 and 2013, Hero gradually received a number of fusion monsters whose materials to summon were any hero monster and any one monster of the 6 main attributes, meaning the game had 6 very generic fusion monsters attached to a popular and competitively viable deck. Hero was never really the best deck of any given format, certainly not during this time frame of 2011 through to 2013, but it was a damn popular one and a frequent deck at a regional level if nothing else. Hero had a few variants throughout the years, ranging from this not really a hero deck, but playing a hero engine because of the strength of a card by the name of Gemini Spark, which is a quick play spell that can tribute any Gemini monster to pop an opponent's card and then draw you 1. Hence why Endymion and Hero are in the same deck list here. But even with only Stratos and some Neos Alias in the deck, this list saw fit to tack in Super Poly in the side as a means to help dismantle or even disrupt boards, since it is a quick play and, again, the opponent can't fucking respond. This build has the added bonus of having 2 quick plays to be wary of. You might be able to avoid a Super Poly hit but fall for a Gemini Spark, or maybe you'll blind MST the Spark and then fall face first into Super Poly. Either way, it's a hell of a time, or a bad one, depending on which side of the Super Poly you're on. This sort of extra deck build was really popular in hero decks for this time, with some number of your extra deck just being these monsters on the one-off chance you run into a deck, or even just a monster that can be removed with Super Poly in any one of your heroes. Wind decks have almost never been relevant, but Stardust Dragon very much was. And Super Poly doesn't destroy, so even if Stardust could respond to it, it doesn't matter because it's just sending it to the grave as fusion material. This stayed true even into the Xyz era, with warrior staples like Heroic Champion Excalibur or Blade Armor Ninja being 1/3 of your extra deck, generic staples such as Utopia or Gaga Cowboy being 1/3 of the extra deck, and the last third of your extra deck being fusion monsters to disrupt the opponent's plays, all which made the deck pretty damn appealing to players. But this was just one niche, somewhat meta application of the card, and this card would see a much more meta relevant use, and that would come right around 2014 with the release of Shaddoll. Because while Hero was the home of Super Poly of sorts up until about 2013 or so, the release of Duelist Alliance in 2014 would give Yu-Gi-Oh! Its first truly top tier fusion deck that could make real use of Super Poly. Every Shaddoll fusion monster needed a Shaddoll monster and any monster of any given attribute, and at release that was of Construct and Winda, who would need a light and a dark monster respectively. And the neat thing about a top deck being a fusion deck was that the genericness of the materials meant Super Poly went from being dumb and annoying to stupid and downright broken, really. Because if the opponent controls any two Shaddoll monsters, you could fuse their entire board to make your own monster. This was a good way to break the opponent's board just to clear the way for an attack, or to break through a window lock and get your own board going if you could make a Construct with it, because Construct was a pretty good card in Shaddolls. It's worth noting that if you were to do this, it wasn't always necessarily the greatest thing in the world, since any opponent's Shaddoll monsters' graveyard effects would trigger on a new chain once Super Poly resolved, so the opponent would get all the graveyard effects, but you are breaking the board somewhat, and as a quick play that can be used in the battle phase, that was more than devastating, I can assure you. This was also great in the context of the other meta decks of the time as well, with other meta relevant cards such as Dante or Deltaros or Baxia, all being light monsters that Shaddoll players could use as materials, not to mention the Burning Abyss monsters being dark to fuel a Winda summon. Granted, Burning Abyss monsters did get their graveyard effects, much like the Shaddolls did, but using an opponent's Seer or Graph as material for a Winda could be a very effective way to get the opponent to waste their one and only special summon while you've got your Floodgate on your board. This was something that did get better with the release of more Shaddoll fusion monsters, as they followed the same pattern of heroes had done prior, namely being one for each attribute. The most notable of these would ultimately be Shekinaga for two reasons. The first being that the Earth attribute was very relevant for the Cleaford matchup of the time, and the fact that it actually has a solid effect, something that the other Shaddoll fusions would ultimately lack. This is a point where Super Poly wasn't a side deck card anymore, it became a main deck staple in Shaddoll decks due to its strength for breaking an opposing Shaddoll board and just being able to use the opponent's monsters to summon out your best ones in general. This was so prominent in the meta that it would ultimately lead to the card being banned by January 2015, just in time for Shaddoll players to replace it with Snatch Steal. It's not relevant or important to this video, but I remember doing exactly that. Which format are we playing under as we approach the new ban list? Because I'll either swap out Super Poly and put in Snatch Steal, or I'll just leave in the Snatch Steal. That was the only difference that my deck did at that time. Anyways, it would stay banned right up until 2018, and when it came back, not only had the game changed by a good and large amount in regards to both the speed and the strength, but especially in regards to the new fusion monsters that Super Poly had access to, something like Starving Venom Fusion Dragon and Mud Dragon of the Swamp, needing any two dark monsters on the field for Starving Venom, and any two monsters with the same attribute but different types for your Mud Dragon, which were both very common to see in plenty of decks. Cyber Dragon is actually one of the first decks that I found playing it generically in order to abuse Mud Dragon, but as the game would approach toss format, Super Poly would get truly good in regard to the meta game, because there were, a number of fusion monsters that were relevant to the toss meta matchup. Thunder Dragon quickly became a meta contender, abusing the effect of Thunder Dragon Colossus to not let the opponent search at all, and also being damn sticky on the board to get rid of, with it able to protect itself from destruction. The strongest board that Thunder Dragon decks were really known to make most frequently would consist of one or two copies of Colossus and a copy of Thunder Dragon Titan for an extra added bit of disruption, which you may notice is an end board consisting of, if nothing else, two dark monsters on the board if they've got both Colossus up, which meant Starving Venom was an effective way to out their board. Even better, if they only had one Titan and one Colossus, you could use both of them to make Predaplant Dragostapelia, which would need any fusion monster and any dark, which Titan and Colossus can make for you. So Pretty easy way to out a Thunder Dragon board, just hard open your Super Poly. It's simply that easy. Likewise, Salamangreat was another deck that made up part of TOS format that fell victim to its own board with Super Poly, as Salamangreat Violet Chimera is a fusion monster that needs any Salamangreat monster and any Link monster for its materials, which meant that at any point in the Salamangreat combo, once they'd summoned a Link monster and had any Salad on board, Super Poly was a very effective way to end their turn before, 2019 would let Nibiru do that instead. And there wasn't much you could do about it, since you're using the monsters of your core deck strategies between both Thunder Dragon and Salad here. Because of this, not only did you see these cards and Super Polymerization in Salamangreat and Thunder Dragon decks for the mirrors or that matchup, but damn near every deck would tech in Super Poly and these cards to be able to beat the opponent's boards in a way that not even the dreaded Danger Thunder Dragon 5 Negate board could really do anything about. Sky Striker decks and Orcus decks would throw this card into the side deck with Reckless Abandon, and countless rogue strategies would do so in the same sort of era. Guru control decks could use it to break boards that had popped up in spite of their floodgates. Altergeist wasn't exactly tight on extra deck space for elaborate combo pieces, and hell, even Necroz's brief revival, or at least revived interest in the game with the release of the incantation cards, would show up with Super Poly in the side due to how effective it was at breaking boards for 2 of the top 4 decks. The end of TOS format would see its usage die down, no doubt because of a shift away from fusion-focused decks in the meta, because while it is true that the release of the generic fusion monsters made many more boards able to be hurt by Super Poly, really Super Poly still works best against fusion decks, just for the existence of things such as Dragostapelia, or monsters with their own generic fusion materials in archetypes like Shaddoll or Salamangreat randomly, and other such decks. And that's more or less the fate of this card in the grand scheme of the metagame. Some hero builds have continued to play it, although it's no longer really being used to make those generic hero tools that they were using in 2013 or so, and it's more so focusing on the ever-present monsters of Starving Venom Fusion Dragon and the like. Now, if I'm keeping it a stack with you, this is the trend you're really going to notice for the rest of the card if you follow this game's history up until now. It kind of dips in and out of play and popularity based on what fusion decks may or may not be meta. So when Shaddoll returned into the meta, you saw another rise of the use of Super Poly for the same reasons that had been the case in 2014. Even Prankids would see a spike of play for this card because chaining Super Poly to an opponent's Pandemonium could simply put be brutal. Sure, you fuse with them, so they do float, but you've almost certainly made a Battle Butler, and if that's the case, then you can Regeki the opponent's board, and now they've lost a total of 6 monsters and their fusion spell, since it's probably going to resolve without effect. And that's not really a bad play, is it? Branded decks would every so often main deck it as well, since so many of the materials to summon their fusion monsters have some generic capacity, to the point that people would even play Despian, Proskenion? Close enough, just as the way to fuse away the opponent's board, and the ever-present Tearlament matchups would play this as well. Using the opponent's monsters to make your own Kit Kalos wasn't a terrible thing. Not to mention, Power of the Elements gave us not only the Tearlament archetype, but also Garura Wings of Resonant Life, a new generic fusion monster that needs any 2 monsters with the same type and attribute, but different names, just for that alternative matchup that Mud Dragon couldn't previously cover, which is incredibly common in countless archetypes, such as Tearlaments, or even Sprite, or like half the decks in the game. And I haven't even gone over all the different applications that Super Poly can have, because while it's been used while certain decks are meta, relevant, and competitive, there are a number of fusion monsters that can be used against specific or generic decks, broadly speaking, if they were to ever become meta. For example, let's see how bad I butcher this one. Predaplant Trifiovertum is the upgraded version of Starving Venom because it needs any 3 dark monsters on the field, being sort of a trade-off. Starving Venom will be live more often when you can summon it, but Trif here will get rid of more of the opponent's board, so you can decide whichever it is you prefer. And I do suppose that in Layer of Darkness, those players really love this card in particular with Super Poly, but there's a number of other fusion monsters as well. Brotherhood of the Firefist Swan is a target if you're playing against a Beast Warrior deck, Drago Necro Nether Soul just needs any 2 zombies, which is a very strong trait when paired with Zombie World because it'll make all of your opponent's monsters zombies. Cybers monsters have 2 fusion monsters if you choose to side Super Poly against them, with both Earth Golem Adagnister and Diplexer Chimera, with Chimera needing any 2 Cybers monsters and Earth Golem needing any Cybers monster and any Link. Or if the opponent is making a fat Link board, there's always World Chalice Garl Dragon Almarduk, which needs any 3 Link monsters. And for the truly most niche of future meta applications you aren't prepared for, there's of course Naturia Gaestrio. Gaestrio? Assman. This needs any 2 Earth Synchro monsters. Now that's specific, but if it comes up in the meta one day, oh boy. And probably there's more cards that you could mention that I've neglected to at this point. Like, I remember my friend using Super Poly against my other friend's Heretic Dragon board in 2011 and summoning 5-headed dragon because for whatever reason Cole decided I need 5 monsters on my field and they're all dragons. That was hilarious. It wasn't common, but it was hilarious. And that's just another example of things that can be used to disrupt the opponent with Super Poly. Regardless, the strength is of course not just that it's using the opponent's monsters to fusion summon, but the fact that the opponent isn't allowed to chain anything in response. Using the opponent's materials is already an incredibly strong effect, and will make this card good and playable really by itself. But the fact that it's the dreaded Speed Spell 4 means that the board is being broken in some manner without any input from you or your opponent. The reason you'll hear people clamoring for this card to be banned is that exact reason there, and honestly, I don't think that's entirely unfair. I play card games to play my cards, as I always say, and not letting me play my damn cards isn't exactly the most fun thing. That's a pretty decent stretch for what this card does. It's not like you just can't respond to this exactly. I'm not going to be heartbroken if it isn't banned anytime soon, but it does prevent play in some manner, which is a fair complaint, even if my Shaddoll-loving ass does want to keep it in the game for just a little bit longer. Overall, Super Poly is a modern-day staple of sorts, or a card that exists just below staple status if nothing else. It can be used generically to outboards, and with cards like Garura, Muddragon, and Starving Venom, there's always going to be good targets regardless of your deck's core game plan. And depending on what it is you're playing, you might even be able to fetch a draw of Garura's effect by linking it away, or swinging big with Starving Venom, just to get that little extra bit more from using your opponent's monsters. But it's at its best in decks with a fusion focus. They can get the most out of it for their own archetype as much as they can the opponent's. That's a trait that's going to keep it strong and relevant so long as the actual purple cards exist in this game, and I don't expect this card's going to be going away anytime soon. And so that's our look at Yu-Gi-Oh! Single card history, Super Polymerization. Stay tuned for our next video, and feel free to suggest some cards to review or what type of video you might like to see. Don't forget to like, and as always, hit that subscribe button to impress your smoking Italian wife, and of course, so you too can be a true duelist. Because while Superhero was the home of Super Poly for the most part